kick us off for the next session. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. So we've started to get into some of the nitty-gritty. So last panel, we talked about some of the challenges that are being faced by industry and trying to be better at how it's managing and sharing its data. In the next panel session, we're going to look at how we can support them. So what are the enablers that will drive change that might help us deliver on that broader vision? Just before we start that, thank you for those of you that have been contributing on Slido. There's some ideas that a number of you put in there, and you've been voting on the poll. I'm going to put a new poll in now to ask about which types of organisations are best placed to help drive change, which will run in parallel to this session. So with that, over to Olivier.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'd like to invite to the stage our last three panelists. Anne-Marie Friel from Pinsent Mason, Miranda Sharp from the Ordnance Survey, and Mark Girolami with a slash in your affiliation. You're here both representing the Centre for Digital Built Britain and the Turing Institute. As Lee was saying, in our last panel, we're going to be, if not relentlessly optimistic, we're going to be looking at the enablers, at how we can accelerate, at how we can scale up change in industries that are not typically the fastest or the most advanced at pacing this change. I would like to ask first our three panelists to briefly introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their perspective. You'll see that we have a really nice range of perspective, and also perhaps tell us a little bit about what it is about today so far that you have found most interesting. I will then have a few questions for the panelists, and as we've done for the earlier panels, we will have a chance for you in the audience to ask our panelists some questions. Anne-Marie, I will turn to you first. Would you like to please introduce yourself and your perspective?
So I am a lawyer. I don't know how many lawyers there are in the room, infrastructure specialist, and quite focused on how we can help clients really deal with digital transformation, encourage and incentivize digital transformation. A little bit first just about the burning platform, because there is a burning platform. Some of the macro strategic issues that the industry, the infrastructure and energy industries have got to deal with are really, really important. We're talking climate change, we're talking flood and drought resilience, we're talking sort of huge shifts in the way people use transport as a result of connected and autonomous vehicles. We're talking about increased need for renewable energy. But there are some real constraints here as well, and I'm talking here about the fact that the industry is widely described as broken. You've got a supply chain who suffering from an endemic of financial ill health, some would say aided and abetted by really quite draconian risk allocation. And you've also got real examples, real live, terrible examples of where the industry aren't getting the basics right. And I'm talking here about things like the Hackett Review, the terrible tragedy that was Grenfell. So this is the sort of context that you need to be realistic about. But in terms of the burning platform, we absolutely need to enable more thoughtful delivery models that will incentivize industry to enable digital transformation to really deliver better outcomes with our assets.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Miranda.
Hello, everybody. I can't pretend that I've been here all morning. I've been at an infrastructure conference this morning. I swapped with Mark at lunchtime. But I work for Ordnance Survey, where I do innovation, an organisation that already thinks it's enormously innovative, and challenges well, I won't talk about that today. But we're at the heart of data, and data that makes sense of other data, which is place data. And so what we see is the challenge of making data useful, usable, and used to as many people as humanly possible. or increasingly machine possible, not humanly possible, machine possible. And in the other part of my role, I work with a number of august individuals on the Digital Framework Task Group, laying down the foundations for the National Digital Twin, which I'm imagining Mark will have talked about at some depth, where the challenge is all about interoperability, but the challenge isn't just technology. That's just one of the three pillars, from what I see it. It's also about collaboration between people and then the business models that make those collaborations and those technologies really sing.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Mark.
So I'm Mark Girolami, and up until a month ago, I was actually Professor of Statistics in the Department of Mathematics at Imperial College. So as far as data is concerned, I think I know one or two things about it. But for the last month, I'm now, I hold chair at the University of Cambridge, where, amongst a few other things, I'm the academic director for the Centre for Digital Built Britain. I also work with Miranda on the Digital Framework Task Group, where I'm looking after the information management framework and the whole common stream. In addition to that, I'm also the director of the Lloyd's Register Foundation's data-centric engineering program, which is hosted at the Alan Turing Institute. And I've been working across a number of engineering sectors. There's been a real sense today that all of the challenges seem to be in the construction sector, and we've heard an awful lot about that. And a month into the job, and I think I would probably agree that most of the challenges are there. But there are other sectors, some of which are digital born, the tech sectors like the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and so forth. And they actually have their own challenges, their own data challenges as well, whilst, of course, being incredibly commercially successful in terms of the market exploitation or the development of markets for data. So I guess I'm coming at this from a number of different angles, and hopefully I'll be able to put some colour onto the views that are shared by my colleagues here in the table.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I wanted for my first question to react to one of the things that Miranda mentioned, is that we have heard throughout the day about the barriers that the commercial models or the regulatory models create to change. I would like to just kind of flip that a little bit and get your perspective. And really, I think we've got, as I said, we've got that perspective from a legal, contractual, innovation, and academic view of things. I'd like to hear from all three of you about what have you seen in terms of new, interesting, or at least promising models for regulatory, but also commercial models that you think will enable change in those sectors. Anne-Marie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult at the moment. If you're a kind of owner or operator of infrastructure looking to really unlock the potential of data in your asset, it's quite a challenge because, and this is just some of the background, the whole industry needs to move in the culture around how it owns, manages, and values data. So we know that we're going to need a big shift to the current status quo in terms of contracting models and otherwise. And I think the uncertainty of digital transformation and the kind of paradigm shifts in the way that communities are likely to interact with your assets also makes it very complex. But I think what we're saying is plan for success now. You're not going to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. You're often planning on kind of 5 or 10-year cycles or maybe even longer if you're an owner or operator of infrastructure. But I think what you need now is some kind of strategy that will enable maximum success and maximum flexibility. And I say when it comes to the legal and commercial issues and the legal and commercial success of your strategy, and I think they are often missed out when I see papers and so on, the whole legal and commercial details that underpin them is missed out. I would say plan for the 3 Cs, and those 3 Cs are what I would call compliance, contracting models, and also contracting terms when it comes to how you deal with your data issues. And then collaboration, how are you incentivizing and encouraging collaboration around the data in your assets? I think it's still quite emerging, honestly. Do I think that the way the industry generally contracts now achieves all of these things? No, I absolutely don't.
Miranda, your perspective, especially as someone who's leading some of the work in geovation, I think you may have seen some innovation in this field that you'd like to talk about.
Certainly the entrepreneurs are grappling with it, but it is often the difficulties. You see large companies and public service entities sort of trying to contort themselves into making themselves easier to do business, and it's easy to be downbeat. I have enormous hope in the National Infrastructure Commission's study on resilience and regulation, both of which, when you dig into answering the questions, realise the problems that are in the way. There was some excellent work which Jennifer Schooling and her team did on the bridge in Tadcaster, where a town was bifurcated when a bridge went down. Following a flood event. And that bridge not only carried the good people of Tadcaster in between the two halves of their town, but that bridge also carried the broadband cable, the power, and the gas. And sort of that, and most importantly of all, when they looked at the retrospective satellite imagery of that bridge, you could predict it was going to fail. So the technology and the data exists. If only we had it talking to each other and people were incentivized to use that information, we would all get much better decisions and much better impact from those decisions. And we hear positive and warm and exciting noises coming out of ICE and Project 13 and the Major Projects Association, and there is the appetite to move, but we're still wrestling with a sort of a governance mechanism and a regulation mechanism, and even sort of a private sector ownership and running of the UK's infrastructure, which means that the interests are fragmented and not aligned. So I try to be optimistic.
Mark?
Yeah, so I think that there is always going to be this tension between regulation and innovation. However, it's absolutely clear, I think, from many of the discussions that I've heard today, is that the requirement for new regulator models, right, working hand in hand with the innovators, is absolutely essential. Now, this is a cultural, this is a societal issue in many ways, but it's one that we really need to grasp quite firmly. I'm actually probably quite optimistic. I feel strangely comfortable that the regulators are looking over our shoulders when we try to innovate. I would far rather they were doing that than allowing us free rein to try whatever cool things we think the technology is coming out of. Clearly, combined regulation and innovation models really need to be developed in some way.
Well, can I take issue with them?
Of course.
So I agree with you, and we can be optimistic, but at the moment our regulatory models are based on lowest consumer price. And the question the water companies are asking is, can we possibly invest appropriately to create a sustainable and balanced water system when under AMP 19, which is the next control period, the regulator is taking a really harsh view and taking out investments, so in such a sort of a grand scale.
Sure, but that was the point, is that these models need to be changed. They need to be developed hand in hand with innovators and with...
That's the interesting thing about bringing the technology together with the industry. You immediately come up with some of the kind of fundamental points of difference that we need to sort of tackle in order to really encourage convergence. And one of them, which I know Mark has probably spoken about this morning, is the need to move to more of a whole life cost model when looking at assets. I think most operators of existing assets would agree that having really great asset information models on their hospitals or whatever else would be great. But at the moment, until the cost of producing those models come down, it's just not necessarily there. And I think that there's going to have to be a combination of the cost coming down in order for the owners and operators to really suddenly see the value for money benefits on doing this in a large scale, let alone when you're dealing at actual construction phase, when all of the focus is on the cost of construction. You know, you can mandate BIM on new public assets, sure, but that's only a tiny part of the story. And at the moment, I think they're quite focused on construction phase only. But there's also this whole difference in risk appetite, which I don't know we were talking about previously, where there's a whole lot of differences in mindsets in the way that the industries approach certain issues that I think we're going to need to shake up around design responsibility, defects, and all of these kinds of good construction-y issues, but also technology issues, very different views on them, in order to really, really drive convergence and collaboration.
I think that we saw a really lovely example this morning of high-low. So their assurance of ships, right? We would not want to, you know, the shipping industry not to have rigorous assurance procedures. And that drove a new business model which brought siloed competitors together to share data, to provide them with a much greater risk assessment, risk prediction model, and therefore service that the whole industry is benefiting from. So, you know, so there's one exception that kind of proves the rule that, you know, having appropriate regulation in many ways can motivate innovation and open up new markets. I mean, it's quite interesting that if I get away from the construction sector and the, you know, really challenging issues that are faced there, if you think of the manufacturing sector and how innovation, because of the availability of data, has actually transformed whole markets. So we move from a product-based market system where we supply widgets or what have you, or aero engines, to supplying a particular service, thrust per hour, as far as aero engines are concerned. There's a manufacturing company, a UK-based manufacturing company in Bath, who have had a very successful business making valves. Shell comes and says, we'll take 1,000 valves off you for this new refinery, wherever. BP says, we'll take another 1,000, and so forth. And their whole business model is now being transformed because those valves can now produce data. And that data provides insight to the assets that they are clamped onto, and not just the assets, but the actual processes that are being controlled, and therefore the products that are being produced by these refineries, for example. And so there is, you know, there is disruption in the in a number of different sectors, and so I have the good fortune that I look at and work across a number of sectors, and I'm not just locked into construction, thank goodness. And so there are lots of, you know, very good examples where, you know, data and the availability of data is opening up innovation and therefore new markets, and transforming these in a disruptive manner.
So I wanted to react to something you said just earlier, Mark, which was about the fact that we are looking at new tech companies coming in and disrupting those sectors. There's something that we haven't really talked about just yet, and that's the notion of scale and the notion that we are seeing those elements of change that do create innovation, but there is a challenge of how do you make that work at really large scale. So my next question to all of you is, do you see any technology or technology in general being the driver or possibly barrier to that scaling up?
I'll give you one example. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. Google, Amazon, Facebook, they have scaled up globally. They operate at a global level. And they operate in a number of markets. Amazon has completely transformed retail. And there are now discussions that perhaps Google may completely disrupt many aspects of construction because they have scaled their technologies, which is basically measurement technologies, which is basically putting sensors onto assets that you want to monitor so that you can best control them and manage the whole life cycle. So there are technology companies that are waiting in the wings to cause disruptions in different sectors. So there's one example where that technology has already scaled up and is now ready to move from one sector to others.
Anne-Marie, just before we came onto the stage, we were talking about the Gemini principles, and you were quite adamant that one of those principles was key to technology really enabling change. Would you like to tell us a little more about that?
I think the Gemini principles are a really good thing. What I think I said when I was feeding into Mark on them was, there's quite a lot of detail here that sits behind in terms of how we deliver it. It struck me that it very much would be best supported by a sort of distributed model. I couldn't imagine the kind of master organisation sitting across all the data model. That feels a bit unrealistic, and I feel having some good enabling distributed database technology sitting behind it would be sensible. I think one of the points I was making when I said the legal and commercial details that sit beneath it is, how do we encourage and incentivize the supply chain to do this? We're sort of 2 to 5 years time, we're kind of at this point, aren't we, where we know there's this amazing data economy that's kind of going to thrive, and we've got some really good early examples, even in the infrastructure sector. Even take TfL sharing their data, Citymapper coming up. All of these great. I know we always use this example, but it's a good one.
Yes.
But how do we really encourage it? And I think parties being commercially incentivized shouldn't be a dirty word. We should be quite open about it. There should be transparency in how these models are being set up, how we're intending to use the data, how we license the rights to use other parties' data, what uses we're able to make of that data, who's liable for that data. And these are the kind of things that will matter. Now, we used the example, didn't we, of moving on an asset information model where you're kind of getting way past level 2 BIM and you're using a truly collaborative information model. And I made the point that the common market standard in construction and infrastructure at the moment is single point design responsibility for all information, regardless of who's done it. And if there was any contractors in the room, they'd really recognise this. I suggest to you that's just one of the many things that will get shaken up by this. And no matter how convenient it is right now to have all of your design responsibilities sitting in one place, these are the kind of things that we're going to have to start thinking differently about.
Unfortunately, you've unleashed my ire with the Citymapper example, which I'll come back to in a wee minute, because I think what is changing is the way people are prepared to view data as an asset and a liability. And we see a lot of behaviours, adverse or otherwise, because people are encumbered with data that can be both, and they tend to waste the goodness of it by worrying what it will tell about them, and because they recognise that by them not using it properly, or by a new mechanism of capturing it and displaying it or using it, such as the West Coast will provide, will change the dynamic. So we look at infrastructure providers who have data on the location of their underground assets, but it's in some grotty legacy format that means it's useful to neither man nor beast. What is the best way of unlocking that value, or could it be done differently with new forms of sensor technology? And that's a live debate. The sharing of data is absolutely, I agree, pivotal. I go a bit crazy when people talk about Citymapper, because when I went to see Move It in Tel Aviv, I made the hideous mistake of saying to them, oh, you're like Citymapper for the rest of the world. And they, in much politer terms than this, said Citymapper is fat and lazy on TfL open APIs. We don't use those. We don't use APIs from transport providers. We capture the information off the phones. We can see where people change speed, change direction, and therefore we can infer a public transport network and what it does and how it is used, so that we can propose a better one. And I think we will see that kind of leapfrog happening in the use and sharing of data beyond that which we're currently seeing. And the question then is, what legacy and what liability does the old data have, and to what extent is it worth mining for good?
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to the audience for questions. We've got one here to begin with. Microphone is coming to you. Microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. There's been some talk about problems with the regulators. Now, my view is that the problem is mainly with the professions that are regulated. Professions are frequently compared with dinosaurs, which I think is very unfair to the dinosaurs who had the decency to roll over and play dead when their time came. The true comparison is with the crocodile, which has denied evolution since the time of the dinosaurs. Now, a recent development, which is quite interesting, was that regulators for legal services required price information to be posted on firms' websites. Now, the latest information that I've seen that anybody has extracted from the regulators is that 30% of firms are denying the professional requirement to provide this open information. I'd like to ask particularly Anne-Marie what she thinks should be done with people who go against regulation to that extent in order to limit the amount of open information and data that is supplied.
Well, thank you for laying the problems of the legal profession at my feet. I have very strong shoulders, and I'm happy to answer this question. I don't propose to know the details of who's on the naughty step on that one, but I do know that the regulation authority for solicitors has actually been making lots of examples of firms lately and of individuals within firms. In fact, it's a hot topic at the moment in the legal press for all sorts of misconduct. None of it, I don't believe, data-related, but it's a really interesting point. If people aren't complying, and we have pretty strict rules on what we have to put into our engagement terms on that, then the consequences should be pretty heavy, I would think. If we're not, one would like to think that professionals should take that kind of thing extremely seriously.
Would you say, Mark, Miranda, that beyond the legal sector, kind of going a little bit broader there, do we have the right mix of positive and negative incentives to get the practices right? The notion that there is a mandate to have, say, price data, but kind of key structural data for a sector out there. Do we have the right mix of positive incentives towards innovation, or does it need to be carrots and sticks, essentially? Yeah. Or stick-shaped carrots and carrot-shaped sticks?
Well, as my wife is a lawyer, the less I say about the legal profession, the better.
Sensible.
So swiftly moving on to carrots and sticks for the engineering professions. I mean, the answer is I'm not entirely sure that we have got and I can't think of any examples where, off the top of my head, that we have got that mix right. I mean, maybe you're aware of some, Miranda.
The only one I would think about is when you were talking earlier about hospital information systems and making them lower cost in order to make them more widely used. I think that so many of the carrots that are coming are going to be cross-sector and are going to require looking across more than one sector or more than one line of business. And I think the articulation of those goods and carrots are really where the next challenge is, because that will not only drive down the cost of creating these data models, but it'll make them worth doing because everybody wants to achieve that goal. And I think then we're back to sort of single industry regulations and the dampening effect that can have.
I think when it comes to lawyers, more sticks, logs, in fact, masts. But for the rest of the world, I think it's a combination of carrots and sticks. I think that the world of compliance around data is actually fairly terrifying. You've got privacy law, and by that I don't just mean data protection, I also mean consumer law. You've got laws around information security. A lot of the infrastructure and energy assets that we're talking about would be considered essential infrastructure for the purposes of the network information systems regulations. There's quite a lot of terrifying obligations in there, I think monitored by the individual regulators for industries around notifying of breaches and so on, which I don't think is really shaken out yet in terms of industry knowledge and awareness. You've also got competition law, which is a real issue. So I was thinking about that great shipbuilding example. You've got to structure that in a way that avoids the regulator getting upset. And increasingly the competition regulator is looking at data transactions and with a really critical eye to say, it's not just the volume of data, what's the special insight, can market dominance be generated through this kind of data? So you've got all of that, but I think in terms of commercial models, we actually need more incentives because of put another obligation on a contractor saying you need to do this. Well, I've just mentioned the Hackett Review and Grenfell and all of this. There are a lot of obligations in there already. Is that really going to drive the change that you want? Probably not. There's a lot of stuff to do already. It's quite hard to keep a handle on it. Budgets aren't getting bigger. Cash flow problems are enormous. Where I see real change happening most successfully in this particular industry around supply side, it's where there's really good commercial incentivization to collaborate and to do things differently, where there's shared incentives. This is where the work, you mentioned Project 13, all of this stuff is quite exciting. So I think it's a combination, but I think there are a lot of sticks around already.
I mean, one of the big issues, you're talking about privacy and so forth. Sir Nigel Shadbolt very eloquently said this morning, that a lot of data is crap. And the regulation around the quality of data, the provenance, how it is actually going to be governed, is something that, in many ways, could do with being emphasised somewhat more.
I wanted to react to that. Are you suggesting that, in terms of driving quality up, it needs to be? Sorry, to stick with the stick and carrot analogy. Do you suggest that it needs to be more of a penalty for bad quality rather than an incentive for good quality?
I think that the point I'm making is that we need to have a way of assuring quality of data, especially if we start to talk about monetizing it. Especially if we start to talk about the reliance on it for, safety critical, health critical applications, then the assurance of data is going to be absolutely essential. And that's the one thing that is probably not being emphasized sufficiently.
And I agree with you. And the other mind shift that has to go on is in infrastructure, we tend to get a bit stuck in thinking about construction rather than whole life. And it's easy to talk about. But we also talk about the asset, not the service and the system of which it forms part. And then that stops us having better discussions about the outcomes and the outputs of it, which we can then measure better. And we need to move the discussion there.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from the room, one here, and then there'll be another one just here at the back.
Richard Clegg, Chief Executive of the Lloyd's Register Foundation. I just want to press a panel a little bit more on this area of regulation and whether there's an opportunity for a paradigm shift in the way that we approach regulation. And I think what I've got in mind is that if you're the regulator, you give somebody a license on behalf of society to do something, whatever that something might be to build a big piece of infrastructure, discharge into the environment, go fracking, whatever it is. You get a license from society on behalf of the regulator to get on and do that. And could the quid pro quo be that, yeah, you can have a license from society, but the quid pro quo is that then you make available for the benefit of society your operational performance, maintenance, environmental data, because if that's pulled, then the world is a better, safer place. So, could regulation and a different approach be the tipping point?
Miranda?
That's a Project 13 principle. Richard Threlfall, when he talks, says that the shift, and he talks about lots of horror stories that are happening in New Zealand and Canada and Hong Kong, where productivity is falling and infrastructure investment needs to be increased. And he says the most important thing we need to do in the governance and the new models of delivering infrastructure, and I wrote it down because I heard him say this morning, is we need to start talking about the long-term stewardship of public assets. And I would actually echo what you're saying, and part of that public asset is the data which is required to deliver it and monitor it and help it deliver its services.
Thank you. We're going to take the question at the back.
From Energy Systems Catapult. This is in relation to a statement that Anne-Marie made a bit earlier on in the discussion. The first question is around where do we think the cost barriers are? And I say this because we recognise that some of the big tech companies have scaled so greatly because of the low cost of computing and the relative amount of kind of open source information and skills that are around in the market. So where do we see the cost barriers there? And from my perspective, it seems like those tech companies are able to scale because of those low costs. So if we're talking about incentivizing companies, are we really talking about the right thing here? Where are the cost barriers for those, and why do we need to incentivize that on a cost basis if those big tech companies have managed to achieve that on their own?
I think this is something that's specific to the industry. So let's take the example of something that's really high on the agenda for the industry at the moment for so many good reasons around the shift to more off-site manufacturing, to reduce, to improve the construction period, to reduce the whole life cost of the asset. There's just so many good things to come out of it to enable us to track kind of provenance of individual components, track sustainability. There's 1,000 reasons why we could go on about why it's really good. What are some of the challenges for the industry? Well, off-site manufacturing, it requires you to front-end load your pricing structure for the delivery or even the maintenance of your asset. On the whole, the industry at the moment is working on what I would call a cost reimbursable basis. Even when it's fixed price contracting, they're measuring production they're measuring how much production's been achieved against a fixed price. You're always just measuring what's being done and paying as you go. And there's a real focus on the construction cost, which is not the way that off-site manufacture is going to be delivered, because you may have to pay for something that's actually, on the face of it, more expensive than constructing the equivalent thing on site, but on the whole is going to deliver you also, less defects, possibly even defects-free. condensed program, all sorts of things. But that is actually, it's a really big challenge for the industry to get into that after years of moving to cost plus. I mean, you don't even get many milestone payments these days in the industry as a result of the Construction Act. Funnily enough, everything's measured. You've also got a really fragmented industry, which I think is actually, when I was listening to you talking about the Googles and Facebooks, I sometimes wonder how interested are they going to be really in this industry, where their business models really rely on scale and having things very standardized on a massive scale, when you're dealing with a hugely fragmented industry, and not just fragmented in terms of market players, but also fragmented in terms of industry markets, what I would call geographical markets. It's just hugely difficult for a technology provider, even with a really good product, to really drive scale. And I seem to see that the people who are having the most early success are those who really understand the industry and have always focused on the industry, whether it's Autodesk or whether it's a kind of small sensor company who's built some really great infra. So I think these are some of the real challenges on the cost and the cost barriers, actually, to really driving change on a large scale. So I talked quite a long time there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We're almost out of time, so just to close, I'm going to ask all of you one last quick question, which I hope you can answer in just a few words. So we're setting out the challenge to create the conditions that sharing engineering data can be done effectively at scale and with impact. My question is, of all the things that we discussed, or the things we haven't had a chance to discuss, what is the one thing that makes you most optimistic? Mark, can I start with you?
The one thing that makes me most optimistic is that the technologies that have been emerging over the last decade are really putting us into a fantastic place to grab these opportunities. And so I won't say what makes me so pessimistic, but that's what makes me optimistic, is the technology.
Thank you. Miranda?
And I would build on that, is that the leadership that would have to use that technology is cognizant of the needs and the opportunities that are available.
Excellent. Anne-Marie?
I will add one and a half things. I'll say it's the increased collaboration that I'm seeing and the convergence, which is really, really exciting, which is all in itself enabled by digital transformation. And it's that shift to the people having a voice and, in fact, the power of the community, which is actually forcing this whole conversation to happen in a different way and is going to force it through possibly faster than any of us anticipate.
Please join me in thanking our three panelists. Thank you.
Your stocks and your changes and your